Hello, and welcome to Sonata She Wrote. This week I'm discussing the first movement of Fanny Hensel's piano trio in D minor, her Opus 11, composed between 1846 and 47 and published posthumously in 1850, 3 years after the composer's death. Hensel, dying in the same month as her brother Felix Mendelssohn, lived from 1805 to 1847. Hensel was born in Hamburg, Germany, and her early life was marked by several geopolitical crises in Europe. Her father was, allegedly, involved in a smuggling operation acting against Napoleon Bonaparte, whose armies were currently occupying much of the region that is now Germany. In 1811, Moses Mendelssohn and his family left Hamburg for Berlin, where they remained permanently. Angela Mace Christian, the author of Fanny Hensel's entry in Grove Music Online, writes that, as a young girl, Hensel probably sensed little of these day-to-day political conflicts or her father's troubles with the authorities. But it is clear that she did absorb the atmosphere of political unrest. Her diaries and letters later in life reveal a broad worldview that often eclipsed her interest in writing about her own life. Against this political backdrop, Hensel grew up in relative comfort in an upper middle-class family. However, though she may have had all her physical needs met, the same cannot be said for her treatment in comparison with her brother. In a letter which appears in Christian's Grove entry, a reply from her father in regards to Hensel's hopes for a career as a professional musician were essentially nipped in the bud. Her father wrote that although for Felix music may become a career, for her it should only ever be an ornament to her femininity. Christian goes on to say that Hensel's professional hopes were extinguished quite early. It was clear that she was to subordinate her ambitions to those of her brother, and prepare instead for her role as a wife, mother, and woman of high class. Music could not be a career for her. Rather, she could only pursue it as a talented amateur and avoid exhibiting any unfeminine ambition. As Hensel's life went on, she was eventually to meet her future husband, Wilhelm Hensel, in 1821, when she was 16, and he was 26. Ew. And after a very long courtship, the two married in 1829, and Hensel spent years as wife and mother. Although she would continue to compose sporadically her entire life, she had only published a few of her lieder under her brother's name. This changed in the penultimate year of her life. Hensel published several previously composed works, and the newly completed, and last of her compositions, Piano Trio in D minor. Her final diary entry in April of 1847 indicates that she had been suffering from a lack of inspiration ever since it had been completed, and she died in May of that same year. The Piano Trio, along with her piano sonata and string quartet, is generally considered to be one of the finest examples of her compositional style. So without further ado, let's get into the music. Dr. Frances Shiwei Lee, in her dissertation titled Unconventional, Sonata Form Manipulations in the Multi-Movement Works of Fanny Hensel, significantly helped me puzzle out the layout of this exposition, particularly in regards to the primary theme zone. So let's hear it, and I'll explain her view. Dr. Lee analyzes this entire section as a type of expanded period, over 30 bars long. In her dissertation, she includes a condensed version of the period, which is on the screen now. Essentially, her argument is that the tempesta-like running 16th notes in the piano can give us a clue as to the small form here. She writes that the sudden absence of these 16th notes is what draws attention to what she calls the rhapsodic insertion within this period. Essentially, an interruption in the small form, which sounds almost like a rebellion of the violinist against the direction of the music. I initially thought the material which followed this interjection may be the transition, a rare example of a transition that begins with energy loss. But I think Dr. Lee's argument that this section is a period is both convincing and also precludes the idea that the transition would start any earlier than the PAC, which ends the section. The transition is therefore a distinct theme, and moves into a feature that Hensel uses throughout this sonata, a particular type of combination of medial caesura and caesura fill at the same time. As the transition ends, Hensel opens a cadential 6/4 progression, another hallmark of this piece. But the period over which it resolves is 6 bars long. This section has the feeling of a caesura to me, but what I would generally consider to be the caesura fill has to also be considered part of the cadential progression, which ultimately culminates in the perfect authentic cadence that opens the secondary theme. That theme, while not entirely P-based, does borrow motivic cells from the primary theme. The third bar of the basic idea and the leaping sevenths of the contrasting idea form the backbone of the secondary theme. As the music continues, you'll notice that eerie tonicizations of D minor eventually cause the theme to unravel. The music falls into F minor and continues to use motivic cells from the primary theme, but is it an example of what we would normally call a trimodular block? Although Dr. Lee labels it as such in her analysis, in my opinion, this area before the appearance of S2 does not really qualify as any kind of standard medial caesura, even given the potential for romantic period deformations. The options for a medial caesura are the cadence types half, imperfect, or perfect, but this music is centered around progressions which focus on a diminished seventh to tonic progression, so I'm inclined to think of them more as failed or blocked medial caesuras than actual medial caesuras. But let me know what you think in the comments below. As S2 continues, you may have noticed another harmonic device which I came to feel was a distinct part of this work, and that is the repeated attempted openings of tonic 6/4 chords. As you may remember, we've discussed in the past how these frustrated cadential progressions can sometimes act as a kind of hint at the tonic and emphasize the struggle to come to cadence. When the theme finally does reach a PAC, it is not with an aggressive drive towards the cadence point, but rather a sense of dying away. In addition to the rhetorical weakness of this cadence, the theme which follows is a nearly exact repetition of the previous S2 theme. Although, as we discussed in Schubert's Death in the Maiden Quartet, one does occasionally see closing themes that may be comprised of an aftermath of the S theme. That isn't what this feels like to me. This is simply a repetition of the previous secondary theme, which has the effect of nullifying the essential cadence. However, as this is the exposition, and the cadence in question was in the minor mode, we might view this not so much as a failure, but as a Hail Mary pass to avoid solidifying the tragic implications of cadencing in the minor median, which, as it's not a generically available key in sonata form, we might interpret as being even more negatively charged than the minor dominant. Although the development is complex and includes multiple distinct areas, this sonata is an example of the Type 3, or textbook sonata layout. The layout probably most of us are the most familiar with: an exposition, development, and recapitulation. Even though Hensel has left some expository material on the cutting room floor, this is essentially turning into a fully rotational development, but it's unusually headed toward the raised mediant, F-sharp minor. After cycling through sequential iterations of the primary theme and building harmonic tension, Hensel uses the same extended cadential 6/4 as caesura effect from the exposition before cadencing in a transformed F-sharp major. And within just a few bars, Hensel manages to modulate into B-flat, more closely related to D minor, by way of an enharmonic equivalent. An E-sharp fully diminished seventh chord is reinterpreted as having the G double sharp, or A, in the bass, the leading tone chord to B-flat major. Although the voice leading in this movement is often disjunct when looking at individual instruments, if one follows lines across instrumental groups, you can see the resolutions are often made there, as if individual instruments are interrupting each other's lines of thought. Though the secondary theme does briefly flash into existence, it's extinguished almost immediately by the return of the primary theme, but in B-flat rather than D minor. Although 6 is a possible but deformational candidate for starting the recap, the extended length of this section makes me label it the start of a new half rotation. It only contains material from before the caesura. Narratively, we might interpret this new second rotation as a sort of stifling of the secondary theme. Hepokoski and Darcy write in their chapter on the development that the presence of a stormy blocked rotation in the developments, P and TR materials only, signifies that the development is dominated by the negative or fatalistic minor mode materials of the exposition. Try as it might, The developmental space cannot burst through the medial caesura point to include the equivalent of the major mode S and C zones of the exposition. Because we've already had a full rotation, the impression is less of domination and more of erasing any trace of the secondary theme. The primary theme, as modulatory and developmental as it was earlier in the development, gives way to the transition, which takes us into the recapitulation. Harmonically, one of the more unusual elements of this sonata form is using 7 chords, far more than the dominant chord, to initiate tonal change where needed. Presumably, this is meant as a commentary on the difficulty of opening up a real dominant tonic progression within the frame of this music. As the development retransitions towards the recap, rather than a dominant lock, Hensel opens a C-sharp diminished 7th chord, which doesn't so much resolve as lead into another extended cadential 6/4 progression, which opens the primary theme. P in this section corresponds to the exposition, except in that the piano and strings roles are reversed. The strings now angrily flashing through these stormy chord outlines, while the piano has the main melodic material of the primary theme. And when the time comes, the strings will have the first transition. The major difference in correspondence is in the period. Instead of a PAC in D minor, we now have a blocked cadence. Whereas the expository transition was comprised of its own theme, and perhaps based on melodic material from, in Dr. Lee's terminology, the rhapsodic insertion, the recap's transition quickly moves on from its own melody and back to the primary theme. And again, in the recap, Hensel uses her own device of the extended cadential 6/4 medial caesura, which resolves here when the cello enters before launching back into the secondary theme. Again, the radiant secondary theme returns, and although it's untroubled by accidental tonicizations of a related minor key, the piano itself eventually slips back into minor. Again, I would say that to me this doesn't seem so much like a trimodular block as simply a second S theme. And when we finally do reach cadence, it is rendered meaningless by the continuation of that same theme. This really only strengthened my view that the erasure of this cadence is meant as a kind of positive. It's putting off the final arbitration of this sonata form for a later movement, similar to the layout of Schubert's Death in the Maiden Quartet. I can see from Dr. Lee's dissertation, and from listening to the remainder of the piece, that there is a strong narrative link between the two outer sonata form movements. After the second S theme and cadence point, the music transitions us into a P-based coda, which ultimately comes to a furious end. I hope you enjoyed this analysis of the first movement of Fanny Hensel's piano trio. I'm looking forward to analyzing the fourth movement as well to discover what links there may be between the two. My sources can be found in the description below, and just a reminder, the channel's schedule is shifting from one video every week to one video every 2 weeks, and an exclusive monthly video for Patreon subscribers. If you'd like to join the Patreon, you can find me at patreon.com/sonatashewrote.